It was a silent night in the heart of New Mexico, when the moon lit up the desert with its silver glow, and the long shadows of the cacti stretched out like motionless specters. Imagine yourself walking through those arid lands at the end of the 19th century, hearing only the rustle of the wind cutting through the dust. Now close your eyes and think of a young man with a piercing gaze, an almost timid smile, but who carried on his shoulders the reputation of one of the most feared gunmen in the history of the Old West. That young man, who never lived past his early 20s, was Henry McCarty, better known as Billy the Kid. But the question that follows us to this day is, who really was Billy the Kid? Over the decades, his name has been wrapped in legends, exaggerations, and contradictory stories. Some portray him as a cold and heartless killer, an outlaw who spread terror wherever he went. Others, however, see in him a kind of tragic hero, a desert Robin Hood who defied corrupt authorities and protected the weak. And it is precisely in that fine line between fact and myth that the life of Billy the Kid becomes fascinating. Because if you search in the newspapers of the time, in witness accounts, or even in popular ballads, you will find versions so different that it seems impossible they are speaking of the same person. Henry McCarty was probably born in 1859 in New York, although there is some uncertainty even about that. He lost his father very young, and his mother, Catherine, did her best to raise him and his brother. She moved several times, trying to ensure a better life. They arrived in Kansas and then in New Mexico, where Catherine remarried. But life was hard, and when she died of tuberculosis, Billy was left practically alone in the world, just over 14 years old, without family, without support, without direction. And perhaps it was there that the figure of the outlaw began to take shape. The first stories of crimes involving Billy were almost insignificant. Petty thefts, stealing clothes, food, nothing that drew much attention. But at that time, a small infraction could forever mark the fate of a young man. Arrested as a teenager for stealing food, Billy escaped from jail in an almost cinematic way. And it was this escape that sparked the first rumors. That frail boy with his harmless appearance had something different. He refused to be tamed. They say Billy had an unusual skill with guns. Some accounts claim he could shoot as fast as few in the West, but what really impressed was his deadly aim. More than that, he had an almost feline agility, capable of escaping ambushes and fleeing impossible situations. It was as if he had been born to survive in a world where the law was fragile and violence constant. But make no mistake, Billy was not just the product of a difficult life. He was also a reflection of a time marked by land disputes, wars between ranches, and corrupt politicians. In New Mexico, the so-called Lincoln County War became the perfect stage for Billy the Kid's name to be etched into history. This war was not a war of armies, but a brutal conflict between factions disputing economic and political power. On one side, powerful merchants with the support of local authorities. On the other, small farmers and cattlemen resisting domination. Billy became involved in this conflict out of loyalty to one of his employers, John Tunstall, a man who had offered him work and a certain degree of protection. When Tunstall was murdered in an ambush, Billy swore revenge, and that promise transformed his life. The young man, until then seen as just another outlaw, became a symbol of resistance against those who oppressed the weak. It was during this period that he gained his reputation as a relentless gunman. Accounts of the time state that Billy directly participated in the death of several men connected to Tunstall's murder. And, as in every good Western story, the numbers vary. Some say he killed more than 20 people. Others claim it was fewer than 10. The fact is that his reputation grew overwhelmingly. For some, he was a vigilante. For others, a cruel murderer. And in the midst of it all, the legend was born. Now, imagine the scene. A young man, no more than 18 years old, with an almost childlike appearance, with that smile that mixed charm and insolence, walking into a saloon as all eyes turned to him, some with fear, others with admiration. Billy the Kid was not just an outlaw, he was a living character of popular imagination. His story spread quickly through towns, exaggerated and reinvented with each retelling. And here comes the interesting part. Contrary to what many think, Billy did not live solely by violence. There are records that he was extremely charismatic, loved to dance, and had an impressive ability to make friends and win hearts. Some say he had several romances throughout his short life, and that women of the Old West swooned over that rebellious boy who faced sheriffs and politicians without fear. That duality, the killer and the charmer, was one of the factors that helped immortalize his name. But Billy's life could not go on indefinitely on that tightrope. His actions put him in the sights of a determined man, Sheriff Pat Garrett. Unlike others who had failed to capture him, Garrett knew the paths of New Mexico, understood the political connections, and knew that, to earn respect, he needed to defeat Billy. Thus began a pursuit that would become legendary, marked by ambushes, spectacular escapes, and twists worthy of cinema. In December of 1880, Billy was finally captured after days of pursuit. Taken to trial, he was sentenced to the gallows. But, as could only be expected in the life of this young outlaw, he managed to carry out one of the boldest escapes in the history of the West. While awaiting his execution, Billy killed 2 guards and escaped in broad daylight, leaving behind yet another mark in his trajectory. This escape was so incredible that, for many, it definitively solidified his image as an unbeatable anti-hero. Now stop for a moment and think about this. A boy barely over 20 years old, with the whole world against him, escaping from prison in an almost unbelievable way. Isn't this the kind of story that still stirs our imagination today? But Billy's luck would not last forever. Pat Garrett did not give up. In July of 1881, after tracking his steps, Garrett managed to surprise him in Fort Sumner. What happened that night is still a matter of debate. Some say that Billy entered unarmed into a dark room and was shot by surprise. Others believe there was an exchange of words, perhaps even a chance to surrender. But the result was the same. At 21 years old, Billy the Kid was dead. Or was he? Yes, because shortly after his death, rumors began to spread that Billy had escaped once again. Contradictory witnesses, strange accounts, people claiming he was seen years later in other states. There were even those who said Billy lived to old age under another name, fleeing from the fame he never wanted. These stories kept the flame of the legend alive, and to this day researchers and the curious try to discover whether, in fact, Billy died that night, or if he managed to fool even death itself. What is fascinating is that, despite having documents, official records, and testimonies, the figure of Billy the Kid has never ceased to be wrapped in mystery. And it is exactly this mystery that keeps curiosity alive. After all, we are not talking about just any gunslinger, but about a symbol of resistance, youth, and rebellion. He embodies the spirit of the Old West, where the line between hero and villain was extremely thin. And in the midst of all this, an important reflection arises. Was Billy the Kid truly a cruel murderer, or just a young man lost in a violent era, trying to survive and find his place in the world? Perhaps we will never have a definitive answer, but one thing is certain. His short life was enough for his name to pass through generations and transform into myth. If there is one thing that keeps Billy the Kid alive to this day, it is not only the facts, but the stories that arose around him. The curious thing is to notice how each version shapes a different character. For some, he was a young man bewitched by violence, dragged into a destiny of blood and gunpowder. For others, he was a victim of an unjust system, a boy abandoned to his own luck who found in the revolver the only way to protect himself. And at that point you realize, Billy is not just a character of the past, he is a mirror of the Old West and everything it represents. The popular ballads of the time, for example, already treated the young man as a legendary figure. Many times, they portrayed him as someone who laughed in the face of death, who danced at local parties without caring about the price life would demand the next day. Imagine the scene. A small community in the middle of the desert, the hall lit by oil lamps, the sound of the violin and banjo echoing, and in the middle of the dance floor, Billy, with a half smile, spinning with a local girl while everyone watched him between fascination and fear. This contrast between the dancer and the gunslinger made his figure even more magnetic, but it cannot be denied that his life was marked by violence. The Lincoln County War was not only about Billy, but about a scenario of corruption, commercial disputes, and a law that served the powerful more than the common people. Alongside the regulators, a group of men seeking revenge for the death of Tunstall, Billy plunged into a conflict that left trails of blood throughout New Mexico. Each ambush, each shootout, each life lost added one more layer of notoriety to his name. However, despite all the reports of deaths attributed to him, there is something intriguing. Billy the Kid was known for not killing without reason. Contrary to the image of a ruthless killer, many stories indicate that he did not shoot unarmed men, that he avoided killing innocents, and that in some cases, he even helped those in need. It is here that the line between fact and legend becomes even more blurred, because in the end, what remains for posterity is not only what he did, but what people believed he did. And perhaps that is why Billy became an icon. Think about it. The Old West has always been fertile ground for myths. Jesse James, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, all of them were turned into larger-than-life figures. But Billy, because of his youth and the way he died, always carried a different weight. He represents the rebellion of youth, the fight against injustice, and at the same time, the high price paid for defying the rules of a relentless world. Now let's go back to the night of July 14th, 1881, in Fort Sumner. Pat Garrett sneaks in, guided by informants who knew Billy's steps. The walls of that place must have already breathed tension. The silence was dense, broken only by the rustling of boots on the wooden floor. Billy, according to some versions, walked into the room unsuspectingly, calling for a friend. Garrett, hidden in the darkness, fired a direct shot to the heart. The young man fell without even having time to react, only 21 years old. But was it really? The versions begin to multiply. Some claim there wasn't enough light for Garrett to know who he was shooting at. Others swear they heard Billy say, "Quien es?" a final gesture of surprise before being silenced. And there are still those who insist that Garrett didn't kill Billy, but another man, allowing the real kid to escape and start a new life under another identity. This theory that Billy survived gained strength over the years. Men appeared decades later claiming to be the real Billy the Kid. One of the most famous was Brushy Bill Roberts in Texas, who in 1950 publicly declared he was the legendary gunman with wrinkles marked by time but with a sparkle in his eyes. Roberts told details of Billy's life that few knew. Some believed him, others didn't. The case became an official investigation, but it was never proven. Even so, the very fact that doubt persists already shows the strength of the myth, and that is precisely what makes Billy so fascinating. If he had lived to be 70 or 80, he probably would have been just another forgotten ex-outlaw, but because he died young, at the height of his legend, his name remained frozen in time. He became eternal. Now, think about how his figure is still exploited today. Movies, books, songs, all find in Billy the perfect raw material to tell stories. From the classic Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid by Sam Peckinpah to more recent portrayals in film and TV series, there is always room to revisit his journey, and curiously, each version chooses a side. Sometimes the cruel killer, sometimes the wronged boy that keeps the flame alive. But beyond the myth, there is the human being, a young man who grew up without a mother, without a father, without support, who learned early that in the West only those who dared to draw fast survived, who was pursued not only for his crimes, but for the burden of having become a symbol of a conflict larger than himself. Perhaps the most intriguing thing is to imagine what his life would have been like if he had chosen another path. He could have been just another anonymous cowboy, driving cattle, along endless trails. Or maybe he would have become a farmer, a sheriff, perhaps even a local politician. But life didn't give him that chance. And here comes a speculative detail that always fascinates those who like to imagine. What if Billy really had survived? Where would he have gone? Could he have crossed the border into Mexico and lived as a common man, far from bullets and saloons? Or would he have continued his journey as a gunman, involved in new wars and new escapes? The fact that we don't know, that we never have definitive answers, is what keeps curiosity alive. Another interesting point is to think about how Billy became a symbol for so many generations after in the United States, especially in the 20th century. He came to be exalted as a representation of rebellious youth, of the free spirit that does not bow to authority. Many saw in him an almost romantic figure who stood up to the powerful even knowing he could not win, and that kind of archetype is irresistible. Perhaps that's why, when we think of the Old West, the image of Billy the Kid comes as easily as that of cowboys driving cattle, noisy saloons, or noontime duels. He is not just part of history, he is part of the collective imagination. And in the end, what we can conclude is that Billy was both a victim and a creator of his own legend. His spectacular escapes, his skill with weapons, his charisma, all of this contributed to him being remembered. But the way people told his stories, how the newspapers of the time sensationalized his acts, how musicians and writers turned him into a myth. That is what truly immortalized him. Today, more than 140 years after his death, we still discuss who he really was: an outlaw, a hero, a lost young man. Perhaps he was all of these at once. What matters is that his story remains alive, feeding movies, books, songs, and of course, our imagination. And now I ask you again, who was Billy the Kid, really? The answer may never be found in official records. Perhaps it lies only in the heart of whoever listens to his story and decides to believe in one version. Because in the end, the Old West was not made only of facts, but of legends. And Billy was, without a doubt, one of the greatest of them. If you've made it this far, it's because this journey through the past stirred your curiosity as much as it stirs mine. And if you want to keep exploring this fascinating world of gunmen, cowboys, saloons, and secrets of the West, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here we don't just tell stories and then we relive legends, so don't forget, turn on notifications, leave your like, and come be part of this journey through the Old West with me, because with every video, a new legend is reborn.